representative of UNCTAD. André Odembrecht Carvalho, Director of the Department of Multilateral Economic Bodies of MRE. Gustavo Ribeiro, Market Access Coordinator and Representative of Executive Directorate of Apex. Vera Torstensen, President of Comércio Technical Barriers to Trade Committee. Now I pass on the floor to Ambassador Luiz Felipe Seixas Correia, 2 times the General Secretary of MGE and President of the MSC, along with UN and other bodies in Geneva, and President of the Business Council of Foreign Relations of Firjan. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Firjan, since I came back to Brazil for my retirement almost 5 years ago, has become kind of my second home here in Rio. Freddie and I have worked for our whole lives together, and we've been doing things that are not only important but also pleasant. And today he asked me to wake up earlier and not have breakfast and come here to be the president of this first session. Anything Fred asks me is kind of an order. So he gave me a cake to eat, so we're okay. So I would like to say that on behalf of Firjan's President, Dr. Eduardo Eugênio Gouveia Vieira, I welcome you all representing the bodies and the presidents of the entities here in this opening panel. The participants that I will later on mention are Mr. Fábio Alves Schmidt da Silva, who has the general coordination of the international articulation of Metro, Mr. Santiago Fernandes de Córdoba, coordinator of the United Nations Forums on Sustainability Standards, UNFSS, and representative of UNCTAD. André Odembrecht Carvalho, Director of the Department of Multilateral Economic Bodies of MRE. Gustavo Ribeiro, Market Access Coordinator and representative of the Executive Directorate of Apex Brazil. And last but not least, my dear friend that I was lucky enough to have as a collaborator in Geneva, and beside dedicating gratefully with a lot of savoir-faire, with a lot of strength when needed, and thinks everything is so funny. So Vera Torstensen, my dear friend, it's a pleasure to have you here in Rio, because here in Brazil, her headquarters is São Paulo. So it's a great pleasure for Firjan, in partnership with Metro and UNFSS, has the second International Convention on Sustainable Trade and Standards. The relation between the sustainable trade and the NVS and the international trade is quite close, and will always be. It will be more and more close, and the effects of this relation generate some concerns, like imposing costs to the industrial sectors and the development of productive processes that are sustainable. This is the key word. This is the key goal of this debate: sustainability. The relation between the voluntary standards on sustainability and the international trade is quite close, and the effects of this relation generates some concerns that will be addressed by the ladies and gentlemen here today and tomorrow, right? 2 days of event. The imposition of costs to the industrial sectors in the development of processes, productive processes that are sustainable when we want to access other markets, especially in developing countries. Due to the NVS are measures coming from international bodies that are private and not governmental bodies. They cannot be questioned by the countries in international forums such as the International Commerce Organization. Do you know that? Are you aware of that? It caught my attention when I read the summary that Firjan brought to me. If on one hand, the NVS brings some challenges to be overcome that can be characterized as commercial barriers or green barriers, they contribute, on the other hand, to the SDGs that are our great challenge here in the 2030 agenda by the state members of UN, as we need methods and production processes that are sustainable. It's important to emphasize that concerns coming from the adoption of environmental measures and its implications to the international trade were provided since GATT 47, when in 48 the group on environmental measures and international trade was created to deal with the subject. On the round in Uruguay between 1986 and 1993, this group has changed into the Committee on Trade and Environment with the goal of analyzing the relations between commercial and environmental measures. It was an important movement in terms of Rio de Janeiro and its importance in the environment. And in 1992, we had the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, known as ECHO 92. Its conclusions were gathered in a document called Agenda 21, presenting the actions to be implemented so that sustainable development was reached at global level in the 20th century. On my ability of working as the International Secretary of Foreign Affairs, I was part of this conference, and I was quite impressed on how serious all participants were and how they worked with this aim that back then had something like an utopia, but today not. Today this is something that people are intended to do with some perspective of complying with the goals. The other important fact was the indication of priority target in the conference in Doha 2001, with emphasis to the target related to the development of the standards and commitments on trade and negotiations and commerce, specific from the WTO on the multilateral agreements on environment. That's because the implications of commercial measures in these agreements, these multilateral agreements for environmental protection, are still with some technical difficulties and financial difficulties to capture and implement the measures, requiring attention regarding the balance of negotiations, and this is something very important. And the target is always more difficult in multilateral negotiations because of getting this balance that is so difficult. And it's important to mention that in June 2018, Firjan announced the adherence to the Global Pact of the UN and the creation of the business group called Firjan SDG, with the aim of creating a strategy of disseminating and implementing the 2030 Agenda in the state of Rio de Janeiro, that, as you know, is the second industrial pole in Brazil. The most recent fact to reinforce the world concern on environmental issues and international trade was the conclusion of the agreement between Mercosur and the European Union in June, this June, contemplating the chapter on trade and sustainable development. The NVS are inserted in this scenario where the private sector define the production processes and the technical requirements and the standards on conformity, compliance, based on the observation of values, sustainable values, and it's important, and social values and ethical values, in order to incorporate the concept of sustainability on the global markets. Well, finishing my speech here, I would like to congratulate Inmetro on the initiative of bringing to Brazil the second international convention. And the first one was taken in 2018 in India, and to promote the debate with the presence of many interested parties. I take this opportunity to also thank all the participants here who collaborated for the accomplishment of this event, in special the United Nations forums on sustainable trades. Firjan is honored to be also part of this initiative, and we wish you all that these days of the event are very fruitful, with a lot of debates and exchange of ideas and building new partnerships. Thank you.
The ambassador, Luiz Felipe, the president of the Foreign Affairs of FIJAN, also the coordinator of the UN, of VSS, and the representative of OCTAD, the Minister of the Department of Economic Organization, Mr. Gustavo Ribeiro, Market Access Coordinator and Representative of APEX, Ms. Vera Tortensend, President of Conmetro, Technical Barriers to Trade Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, in the name of the President of InMetro, I would like to welcome you all. The President was not able to be here because she went to represent the Secretariat of Competition in a Brazilian-Germany Economic Forum in Natal. InMetro is very proud to bring to Brazil and to work along with the Forum of the UN, with the VSS and FIJAN, the second international committee of VSS. As an executive organ of InMetro, our system here in Brazil, InMetro is the responsible one in Brazil for the dissemination of the meteorological patterns to be able to monitor the Brazilian product and integrate to the value chains and make it competitive on the more exigent markets. And it's also responsible to the approval and fiscalization of all the equipment in the areas to make it more fair to producers and consumers. InMetro is also responsible for the Quality and Infrastructure Labs network and all the organisms of certification that allows products in Brazil to be compatible with its similars being produced abroad. InMetro also works as a regulator to the safety of consuming products to many sectors in Brazil, and also electrical products. All that framework is around 10.5 of the Brazilian GDP. InMetro is also the organization which is responsible to give transparency to the regulations in Brazil for the WTO. And also the Institute supports all the Brazilian commerciers to work along with the GDP and the technical exigencies in this market around these products. All the VSS are a reality that's present in the trading system here in Brazil, especially for the medium producers, and is also an opportunity for the SDG. Also, as a contribution to these standards, all the certification issues and the ways they can contribute to the SDG on the 2030 agenda. A second contribution regarding the competence of InMetro to support the GDP. It is really important for us to meet those goals. The economical impact and all the issues that are present on these VSS, they are of three kinds: the cost of conformity to the producers, the proliferation of these standards, and the lack of institutionality in these VSS, which still are out of the WTO systems. Most of these measures are private organisms and not from the government, different from the technical measurements and procedures of evaluation on the TBT agreement. And so we come back to the InMetro role regarding the VSS. InMetro is really worried with the impact of those VSS because we don't have an institutionalization of these standards as the role it plays with InMetro. So we established the VSS, the Brazilian VSS. The platform wants to discuss the knowledge of the VSS to the Brazilian producers and also to be able to supply those tools to mitigate the negative impacts of the VSS. We want to support private and public and NGO companies, giving support to the producers and letting them know that the VSS are present here. And we want also to cooperate with the shareholders and the international companies and the SDG patterns. of the UN. Also, we are trying to reach all these objectives, these goals, and Metro is really proud to be part of these systems with Brazilian companies and also abroad companies. The 5 agencies that are in the forum, UNCTAD, FAR, UNEP, the ITC, and UNIDO. These platforms like India, China, the South African platform, other partner platforms like the Brazilian Apex Brazil, and all the companies that are here present, the consortium IPAM, EcoConsult, WWE Brazil, the Brazilian Association of the Food Association, OSCM International, ISO, and the ICCS of Fundação Getúlio Vargas. I would like to also highlight the support of Firjan, because we would not be able to accomplish this event. Also, I would like to highlight all the VSS impacts on the compliance of the SDGs of the 2030 Agenda. The VSS are closer to the 9 of those SDGs. This possibility of contribution to the implementation of the agenda brings us a better dimension, a positive dimension, to a dialogue that could be seen on a biased vision. The multiple shareholders, if they are able to cooperate to reach those SDGs, they are going to contribute to the compliance of the Brazilian commitments to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda in Brazil. We really hope that this dialogue and the exchange of ideas, we can be able to create a better system of partnerships, to create a new project, to be able to to build a better job in the next few months. In the name of our president and all our supporting body here, welcome everyone here. I hope all the local participants from many different regions in Brazil and abroad are able to have a great dialogue. Thank you.
Ambassador Luis Felipe de Seixas Correa,
Embaixador Luis Felipe,
Minister André Obredeis Carvalho, Mr. Gustavo Ribeiro, Ms. Vera Torsten, our friend, distinguished guests, señoras y señores, bom dia. On behalf of
em nome das 5
Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, I warmly welcome you all to the second International Convention on Sustainable Trade and Standards. I wish to start by expressing our appreciation to our co-organizers in Metro and Firjan, and the authorities of the government of Brazil present here for this excellent collaboration and hospitality. Allow me to provide you a bit of background on this convention. 2 years ago, we met in China for our first international multi-stakeholder dialogue hosted by UNFSS and the government of China. The event there highlighted the significance of sustainability standards as a tool for sustainable development and market access. Last year, together with the Quality Council of India, we hosted the first international convention in New Delhi. The event delivered the first action plan on cooperation on sustainable standards between national platforms. And one of the outcomes of this action plan is actually this second convention. Here in Rio de Janeiro, we intend to bring the discussions yet another step higher by debating on sustainable supply chains and standards, and the opportunities and challenges these standards pose to our countries, as well as their connection with the UN SDGs effort. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development provides a roadmap for prosperity, dignity, and a better planet for all. However, to achieve this prosperity, we need to change the way we're doing things. For a start, we need to change the way we consume, the way we produce, and the way we trade. This is where standards play an important role for sustainable and inclusive development. Standards that uphold the sustainability of production have the potential to unlock new markets, supporting trade and economic growth, while addressing environmental protection and inclusive social development. But it's not only about the potential of sustainability standards. Consumers' demand for sustainable products continues to increase. There are currently almost over 500 sustainability standards operating in all the markets of the world. Certified sustainable production has grown year after year since the beginning of this century, reaching, for example, 26% of the world production of coffee, or 23% of global cocoa production area. And yet this number does not include the so-called traditional sustainable standards. Sustainability standards have become the market reality for competitiveness and supply chain management. Today's convention is about leveraging this new market reality together with international trade as engine for sustainable development. It will do so by providing a space for actors all along the value chains to share their experiences and best practices on sustainable production and trade. Señoras y señores, this convention is also about Brazil and Latin America as a whole. Latin America exports depend on agribusiness, which are largely affected by sustainability criteria. For example, estimates show that sustainability standards can affect up to 44% of the total value of Brazilian exports. This can represent an opportunity and a challenge for our countries. In this context, the convention aims to disseminate good practices about growing international emphasis and sustainability measures. We will launch two important studies today and tomorrow. First, a study prepared by Metro covering the sustainable practices on 4 products important to Brazil: on leather, on fruit, nuts, and vegetable oils. Second, a study prepared by UNFSS and the Andean Community Secretariat on sustainability standards as a measure to promote sustainable value chains and novel food exports in the Andean region. These two important pieces of knowledge were developed to advance the knowledge on the implications on sustainability standards in our region. Furthermore, the convention will cover a wide range of issues, from the importance of industry and agricultural actors in achieving the SDGs to the concept of biodiversity and harnessing green value chains, from the role of multi-stakeholders dialogue to addressing multiplicity of standards and looking into the future of sustainability standards. Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, we, the United Nations member agencies of UNFSS, supporting this convention, namely FAO, ITC, UNCTAD, UN Environment, and UNIDO, join forces with you in making sustainable standards an engine to achieve prosperity for all. There are many issues to discuss. I wish everyone success in your dialogues and networking during these 3 days of the convention. Muito obrigado.
Bom dia a todos.
Everyone, I would like to thank initially all the organizers of this event, Fisha, through the ambassador Seixas Correa. He was my boss at Itamaraty twice as General Secretariat Exteriors Convention. And also, Fabio, he was from my office and works for Metro. I think this is my contribution, my personal contribution to the sustainability agenda. I think my work there is less sustainable after Fabio left, but my loss was in Metro's gain. So also INSS through Fernando Ricordo, Gustavo Ribeiro, Professor Vera, the president of Conmetro. I would like to just say a quick word of acknowledgement of Itamaraty, of the importance of the second convention, and also all these issues. The private standards are a reality that is growing a lot, and it will keep growing in the future. And they answer, as we all acknowledge, to a concern that's absolutely legit as sustainability. And they also brings us, as we can see through history and the private patterns, they bring a risk that is associated to the closing of a market. So our duty here is really clear. How can we be able to potentialize the greatest benefits from those standards in terms of improving the production practices, in terms of access to that market by differentiating products and avoiding the illegitimate uses that are here to close those markets. So we need an international conversation. We need harmonization. We need transparency, legitimacy, monitoring. And Brazil is a strong advocate of this international discussion. And we think, yes, the Brazilian government thinks that the obligations of the WTO are going to bring this discussion to the obligation of these governments regarding the private standards. And our opinion on this topic is not consensual. So, as we are creating other spaces to the debate of this issue, we need to use well these spaces, like the debates of the national platforms, as the discussion here on the second convention. It is key to find ways through we particularly can think of the situation of the developing countries and the situation of the small companies on those countries that frequently are affected by the insufficiency of information, by financial limitations. Frequently, they are affected by the multiplicity of patterns of standards that are applied in a non-harmonized way, and that creates many losses. So we really wish the greatest success on today's discussions and the next few days. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Bom dia a todos. How are you doing? Wonderful. So first, I would like to thank the opportunity to be here representing the Directorate of Apex that is not here due to a simple reason. Today, it is our council meeting, the highest board of Apex, the first meeting of this new managing. So our presidency and all our directors, they are at that meeting right now at CDA. Anyway, I would like to salute all our directorate here, especially to the Ambassador Seixas Correia, to Fabio Silva from Metro, Santiago Fernandes de Córdoba of UNFSS, André Carvalho from Itamaraty, and of course, Miss Professor Vera Thorstensen. It's always a great pleasure to meet you and all the present here. So, this is a great challenge since everyone before me has talked about all the issues that I was going to talk about right now with a lot of precision, and even Professor Vera, who is going to talk after me. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about mainly the reason and why APEX, which is an agency of promoting exportation, is always working with the VSS, and the importance for us to work with this issue and all the actions of our agency and internally.
And if you allow me, I will give a little bit of context on APEX that I think is important. APEX is a non-profit agency with public utility, and since 2016 we are linked to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as an agency. And the creation of APEX was in 2003, so we are almost 20 years. So over the last years with this work directly related to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And there are basically 3 lines of actions on APEX. One is directly related to the subject and of VSS, and this is the work of the agency on the promotion of export. The 2 other lines involve the points related to attracting foreign investments to Brazil, and the last one is related to the internationalization of companies to international markets. So this first line of promotion of exports is naturally related to voluntary standards of sustainability, and more than that, in promoting exports, there are actions, cross-sectional actions, dealing with the qualification of companies and the production of intelligence and access to markets and intelligence of market analysis, involving also the deep knowledge on the VSS. Anyhow, only to give a context here to you, this agency is supporting about 15,000 companies in Brazil. And just for you to have an idea, today the portfolio of Brazilian companies is about 26,000 companies. So we are talking about basically 2/3 of companies, Brazilian export companies, being supported by APEX. And a very important point that has to do with today's subject is that the characteristic of these companies is that they are mainly companies of small or medium size, exporting to more than 200 markets. And again, giving a context and showing a little bit of how big it is, these companies export about $52 million a year, representing about 22% of Brazilian exports, at least based on the numbers of 2018. The sectors are varied. We have sectors that are more related to intensive resources, from the sectors of animal proteins or coffee, rice, sugar, up to sectors like technology that are also supporting the exports of products and services like, for example, softwares, exporting services, which is also very strong in the agenda of the agency, and also less conventional sectors like fashion that the agency is working with. So, having that said, I would like to emphasize 3 contact points about the role of the agency and this context, specifically related to the subject that we'll deal today here, that you will deal in the studies, in these 2 days of event here in Rio. And by the way, in this wonderful building at Casa Firjan that we have the opportunity of knowing today. And these 3 points have to do with the internal view of APEX on sustainability that I couldn't avoid mentioning. And the second point is the expanding this internal view to external actions. And the third point is the reading of the agency and the changes of the structures of global governance that we see today in the world. So briefly, this first point of the internal understanding has a lot to do with taking care of our home, first of all, so that we can obviously reflect what we have internally in actions of the agency. The idea that we may inspire our partners with our programs and projects, starting with this internal reference in the agency. And we have world things here. Apex takes a certified building that is sustainable, and we have a lot of policies on sustainability in use of resources from paper to water in the daily life of Apex. And obviously, an important fact is that Apex is also a signee of the Global Pact since 2018, and I don't even need to explain that. I mean, this relation with the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. Having that said, this view that we have internally, we try to expand and have this spillover effect of this awareness to the outside world, reflecting in our projects with our partners, may they be sectorial entities, companies, and obviously the government. And in this sense, the view, the understanding that we have is that sustainability naturally takes to the companies supported by the company and the agencies a relevant factor regarding access to the market. We generally say, and probably this is not a joke, but for a promotion agency, we say that there is no promotion without access. It doesn't matter if you go to fairs or map markets with the quantitative intelligence if, in fact, you have no access to that market. And, of course, access implies knowledge of the more traditional subjects of access related to governmental regulation, and also those related to all knowledge related to the private standards that may impact the access to markets. So in this sense, we train companies, we bring information, we organize this information in data banks, and we try to give all this knowledge to the companies that we support. Lastly, the last point, I talked about the internal issues and passing the internal view to external actions, and now the last point, that is what I mentioned about the perception of the agency regarding governance, global governance, and how it changes. And it's an interesting point. We have a lot of academic studies on that. Professor Vera knows, and there are many different names for that, for this discussion of the subject on the idea of administrative law globally, and for the academics of law and people of international trade affairs, the lack of knowledge of the transnational regulatory agencies. But the point here is the perception that the agency is inserted in this context, and it's necessary for us to understand how this governance reaches access on the other side by restricting markets. It was very well mentioned by Minister André, Fabio, and the ambassador, everybody who spoke before me, that here the concern, the effective concern, is to know how those standards are created with the transparency regarding its creation. And obviously, the multiplicity of the standards on the international trade. So if on one side we know the standards, we understand them, and it means the possibility of more access at the same time of the demand on markets, valuing certification, and are available to pay for that. But on the other side, we restrict eventually how it can impact our partners. So an important point here is to note that these effects vary from chain to chain. It's difficult to have clear rules or understandings on impact in a generalized way in all chains, because the chains are distinct, they have distant inputs, and they use natural resources in distinct ways as well. So generalizing is quite complex. And obviously, if we have doubts and they persist and knowledge is still being created, data is necessary. And what we hope as an agency and supporting this event is that we can make use of the knowledge generated by you, the experts, who will be part of this discussion in the next days at different levels, may it be theoretical or in empirism or forming policies for international trade. I tried to be brief, but I would like to thank here for the invitation to be here with you, and thank for the host and having me here, and the partnership with Firjan, Metro, UNFSS, and I wish you great success over the next days on the work of the convention. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Brief words to finish here. Ambassador, it's a great pleasure to have you here. As funny as it is, this subject has arisen in Geneva in 2000. I mean, when the international trade was getting together, in the past we were concerned about the frontiers, I mean the rates and the origin rules and all the subjects related to protection that were controlled and dealt internationally in the frontier. The world has changed completely. Today, trade is not as important anymore. As I say, the world today is living the clear presence of regulatory wars, where we have the United States and Europe with different models and antagonic models, and many of these rules are in this sense. And now China is in the digital area, clearly. But what is the problem that we have today? The sustainability point, I mean, today we cannot think about commerce and trade and agreements with the European Union or the United States and the other countries without we have this subject under negotiation. And what is the big problem, Mr. Ambassador, on sustainability is that differently from the other rules and standards that somehow are negotiated by governments and have in their basis the compliance with the rules, when we are talking about private standards, and I'm sorry, André, this is a wrong name, this is sustainability standards, because private standard, we have all the ISO rules like this with technical and standards that are very good and working, but what happens? Sustainability is mandatory, it's quite important. Without it, we have no commerce, no trade. So today, it's the most important barrier for the commerce, and it has to be dealt and worked. And the question is, how do you go from standards, sustainability standards that are done by all these organizations and people that are really concerned about the subject, and how do you change it into rules, multilateral rules? And the problem is that it's not governments, it's entities, and then we start the big problems. We have many of them. We mentioned 500 raised by the UNFSS, but we also have the point of those who establish the rules, who certify, who goes to the field to say what is done or not. I mean, I remember many of the negotiations on technical barriers, and as the ambassador mentioned, we had discussions with so many countries and lack of coordination that it changed into big barriers to trade. So to finish, I would say that we are living the right moment where the sustainability standards need strong coordination. I truly would like to see the ISO of sustainability standards. I see the work of ISO and other organizations. So this is the moment for the experts on standards on sustainability to get coordinated and establish clear rules and standards, and those establishing that are the ones who control and supervise and who certify later on. Otherwise, it goes against the objectives, the goals that are quite new, and not everybody agrees. And my last words on IMETRO, I remember in 2000-something when Ambassador Guilherme Vazos was talking about the standards on sustainability, and I said, well, Brazil has it in a very important way due to agriculture. We need to think how this platform will work, and we were discussing the platforms on China and Niger, and I said, okay, we need a platform for Brazil. And then we had the great pleasure to see that IMETRO was taking this idea, and I think to IMETRO, it became one of the most important areas for its work. So it is an agency, it has to be like this and related to dialogues with the private sector, but also having the basis in measurement on how to do and accredit everything and how the standards are made. This is important. So thank you all. Let's work a lot during these days and give one step ahead what we have so far. Thank you.
Well, we thank you very much.
Bem, obrigada.
Messages to the audience, and may I kindly ask you to step to the front for a quick photo, a group photo first, before you go back to your seat. All right. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, bom dia. By way of introduction, my name is Ruby Lambert, and I'm here today as one of the representatives of the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, known as UNFSS, as we heard just now, an initiative of 5 UN agencies. So, together, along with Firjan and IMETRO and the UNFSS Steering Committee, we would like to bring on stage 2 of the most renowned experts in this field. Please allow us to welcome Dr. Axel Marx, Deputy Director of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies from the University of Leuven, and Professor Junji Nakagawa from Gakuin University. Let me first give you a short introduction of Dr. Axel Marx, who's going to come first. He's been working on voluntary sustainability standards for more than 15 years, analyzing their emergence, development, and design, and how they interact with public policy. His publications on VSS can be found in leading international academic journals and books, and has also written reports and briefings on VSS for international organizations, for national governments and private organizations. Now, let us hear from him a very interesting keynote on sustainable trade.
Thank you, Ruby.
Thanks. That's
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, President, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the organizers very much for inviting me to give some opening remarks on the Second International Convention on Sustainable Trade and Standards. I think the conference promises to become a very interesting event discussing several of the key issues. And in my opening talk, I will first give a bit of context related to global value chains and the link with the SDGs. But then, more importantly, I will focus on some of the challenges I think we need to overcome if we want to have the full potential of voluntary sustainability standards to contribute to the SDGs. I really believe they can make a huge contribution to making global value chains more sustainable, but I also think we need to overcome some of the challenges. Let me briefly start with a bit of the context. As Ruby said, I've been studying voluntary sustainability standards for quite a couple of years. And actually, my interest started more than 20 years ago when I was a student in Cambridge University studying environment and development. And one of the key issues then, and it was also mentioned in the opening addresses, was how to make transnational governance or transnational trade more sustainable. How can we govern on a global scale? And the context at that stage was one of a spectacular growth in international trade. Until 2010, and the 50 years before that, international trade has really expanded enormously, with a more than 30-fold increase in the volume of trade. But it was not only the increase in the volume of trade, which was very important, but also a change in the nature of trade. And that's captured by this idea of global supply chains and global value chains. Now, goods are no longer made in one country, but they are made throughout the world. And Professor Hoekman said that, for instance, through the use of information technologies, production lines are splintering. They are crossing borders, and they generate all types of environmental and social consequences. Then, how to govern in such a context was one of the key issues and questions which then emerged. And at that point, voluntary sustainability standards, or certification schemes as they were called, emerged. And Yale professor Ben Kishore mentioned in one of the early books, really looking in depth into these sustainability standards, that they were one of the most innovative, startling new governance arrangements to govern on a global scale. Later on, you had books coming out on the certification solution, the certification revolution, and so on. The importance of these often private initiatives in their contribution they can make to sustainable development is also recognized in the 2030 agenda. In this agenda, public-private partnerships have become ever more prominent. And as we know, the UN 2030 agenda is a plan for action for people, planet, and prosperity. And the 17 goals cover a lot of the issues related to sustainable development. Now, these SDGs, as we all know, they build on the Millennium Development Goals. But what makes the SDGs quite new in that respect is that they are not only more encompassing than the Millennium Development Goals, but that they recognize the importance of private actors and public-private interactions to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And many standards have recognized that as well. One can find many references in the standard documents to how they can contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. In the third flagship report of the UNFSS, they also identified at least 8 SDGs where voluntary sustainability standards can play an important role. So here they play, I think, are a crucial nexus in achieving some of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now let me come to the challenges. I believe sustainable development goals can be achieved and that voluntary sustainability standards can play an important role in that. But I also do think that we need to address some of the challenges. And in this opening address, I want to briefly touch on 3 of the challenges, which were actually also mentioned already by a few people in the opening remarks. One challenge really has to do with scaling up the use of voluntary sustainability standards. We all heard and we all agreed that it's an important phenomenon, but when we look at adoption rates on a global scale, it's still quite limited, and I will say a few words about that. Second issue, which was also mentioned, is to look at the impact of sustainability standards and to better understand where they can make the most significant impact on the different dimensions of sustainability. And then the third aspect, which was addressed by several speakers in the first panel, is how to deal with the proliferation of standards and the institutional context in which standards operate. And I want to offer some reflections on that as well. Let me start with the adoption. In order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the important role voluntary sustainability standards can play in that, they need to be used widely and by many producers. Hence, high adoption rates are very important. And currently, voluntary sustainability standards are adopted, but there are 2 issues in my mind. One is that in some countries, there is hardly any adoption of standards. And these maps I show you come from a research I did a couple of years ago, where we tried to look at the countries in which some specific standards are operational. And I just displayed that for 2 standards. And the blue and the yellow colors are where standards are operational, operating, where they are certifying producers. The gray ones are where they are not operational. And that might change a little bit over time, but what the image tries to capture is that, especially in Africa and Central Asia, it's sometimes very difficult to get certain standards off the ground. Secondly, when we zoom in more deeply on the adoption of standards, is that in some countries they are active, but their adoption is quite low, and it's not really quickly increasing. So there is some kind of, let's say, dynamic where standards get off, but where the adoption or overall adoption remains quite limited. Then the question is, what can we do about it? Or how can we think about addressing this? And there, I think, several actions can be taken. And throughout the days, we will hear a lot about the potential of international dialogues, international cooperation, and so on, to foster higher adoption rates. And I think that's important, and we can return to that. But I want to highlight maybe 3 aspects which might provide incentives for higher adoption, which we might want to discuss further and which we might want to explore further. And that has to do with basically integrating voluntary sustainability standards further in existing public policies. And that can be done actually in many ways, and I want to briefly highlight 3. There are 3 types of interaction, I think, which can be further pursued to influence the adoption of sustainability standards. One has to do, and we heard also a bit about it, is by further integrating standards in trade policy. And here we can explore different options. Some even have suggested that we might want to think about having different tariffs for certified products versus non-certified products. That will certainly create a big debate within the context of the WTO. And it's not sure whether that's the route to go, but making price differentials on the basis of certification might be one way to provide incentives for further adoption. A second one, which was also mentioned already this morning, and it's, let's say, a more softer approach, but which has been used much more widely recently, is to integrate sustainability standards in bilateral trade agreements. And that can be by providing platforms or incentives to exchange information, to stimulate the adoption of eco-labels and certification schemes. One can think of many different ways in which trade agreements can play a role here. Just to highlight that, for instance, the European Union Since 2011, the free trade agreement with South Korea has been systematically integrating provisions on sustainability standards, on eco-labels and certification in their trade agreements. And as was mentioned this morning, very recently in the EU-Mercosur agreement, they also agreed to have a provision on eco-labels in there, and both partners really express a commitment to work on this. Such an approach is more, let's say, soft and will not have a very direct impact, but in the longer term can make an important contribution to awareness raising on voluntary sustainability standards. Second option is to integrate voluntary sustainability standards in public regulation. With this I mean is having some kind of role of voluntary sustainability standards in the enforcement, implementation, and monitoring of regulations. And also this is already happening to a degree. The EU Renewable Energy Directive recognizes 17 voluntary sustainability standards in the directive, which is used as proof that biofuels are sustainable when they enter the European market or when they are produced on the European market. Here, standards provide the regulatory agency with the capacity to monitor the sustainability of products. More recently, in South Korea, with the revision of the Act on Sustainable Use of Trade in South Korea, which came in force in 2018, they also made an explicit reference to certain voluntary sustainability standards, which are proof of verification that timber is legally harvested, and which importers need in order to sell timber on the Korean market. And if we go across the world, there are several of these pockets of examples which actually show that the integration of voluntary sustainability standards might have an impact on adoption. Third point in relation to providing incentives for adoption is integrating sustainability standards in public procurement. As we all know, governments are the biggest buyers on the market, and they might want to take into account sustainability, quality aspects when they are buying products. And here, sustainability standards can act as a proof of sustainability, as a shortcut, let's say, in order to buy products on the markets. If governments systematically starting to integrate sustainability standards in the sustainable public procurement, that will definitely have an impact on their adoption. Now, all what I've said assumes that voluntary sustainability standards have strong impact. But that's actually an assumption we also have to critically assess. And here I come to my second challenge. And that has to do with the fact that I think we need a much better understanding of where, when, and how voluntary sustainability standards make a contribution to achieving sustainable development. I'm not going to go over all the many impact studies which already have been published, and there are quite a few. And they actually show very mixed results. And it's sometimes that some standards in some countries generate a positive environmental impact, but less on social and economic aspects, or that they generate, for instance, an impact on labor rights protection, but less on the environment. All of these studies actually show that the impact is very context-specific, depends between standards and so on. I do think that there was actually one consistent finding across all these studies, and that is that actually very few standards achieve in having an impact on all dimensions of sustainable development. And that brings me a bit to the question that is, I do think we need to really better understand under what conditions and on what parameters sustainability standards might make the biggest impact. And that will allow us to understand better what their potential is for achieving the sustainable development goals. Then finally, a key condition for standards to have an impact in the first place is that they should be designed and have procedures to really implement and enforce the standards they set up. And many of you will have seen a slide like this many times before. And it's just the idea to capture the proliferation of standards. The International Trade Standards maps out, I think, currently around 150 standards. The Eco-Label Index database reported, I think, on Friday, 463 standards. You can find very different figures. But what this proliferation does is that it actually creates two problems, at least two problems. One is it creates confusion for consumers about which label to trust. And indeed, not all labels or all VSS are equally trustworthy. And secondly, and importantly, it creates problems for producers, which might sometimes have to comply with multiple labels, which increases costs of certification. And there we create a situation where we actually have a market of voluntary sustainability standards, which often compete more than they cooperate with one another. And I do think, and it's been mentioned a few times before, that we need to start thinking about how to order this market and who should play a role there. And it is definitely a role for the standards themselves. There's a role for international organizations. There's a role for governments. One can think of many different options. But let me explore very briefly three I think we need to think more about. One is when can we provide incentives for standards to collaborate more? We have the example of Rainforest Alliance and UTS, which made a merger, and that can already consolidate the market. That's one way. Second important issue, I think, is thinking about how to stimulate mutual recognition. And this bit strange slide depicts a study I've done quite a number of years ago about the level of mutual recognition between standards. And each dot is a standard. There are more than 400. And what the picture actually wants to depict is that many, many standards don't recognize any other standard. So there is some kind of competition between one another. And especially for producers, that's very worrisome. Because if they always have to get certified and invest the cost to get certification for multiple labels, that's quite an important cost and might inhibit the adoption of voluntary sustainability standards. So addressing mutual recognition or promoting mutual recognition, I think, is one of the most important issues. Thirdly, and that's also been mentioned, that's some kind of the governance structure of voluntary sustainability standards. One can call it the meta-governance of voluntary sustainability standards, but I do think we need to make some progress on getting, let's say, more international rules, maybe also linked to WTO, to government policies and so on voluntary sustainability standards. So let me conclude. Addressing these challenges might contribute to making value chains more sustainable. This is the core topic of this international convention, and I think this conference will give enough food for thought on these different challenges and the contributions voluntary sustainability standards can make to the SDGs. I'm looking very much forward to the conference and wish you all very fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hexel Marx. As he has emphasized, we all have a role to play. Now, I'm just going to quickly introduce Professor Junji Nakagawa, who is the chairman of the Asian WTO Research Network and the Asia International Economic Law Network. His research covers a wide range of public international law regulating transnational economic transactions. He has published several academic journals, namely on international economic law, harmonization regulations, trade liberalization, among many others. Now, let us welcome him to present his keynote on standards, trade, and sustainable development goals.
Thanks so much, Ruby, for your kind introduction. Bon dia. Thank you so much for the organizers for having invited me to be a keynote speaker. If I remember correctly, this is my 5th visit of the city of Rio. And yesterday, from the balcony of my hotel, I already enjoyed watching Corcovado in clouds. Anyway, so my topic of the speech is the relationship among standards, trade, and sustainable development. Here, I'd like to do a bit of analytical exercise of the relationship among these three items. Yes, this is a four-part speech. And the first part is a little bit overlaps with the presentation keynote with Axel. The VSS, Voluntary Sustainability Standards, it's plural, have become mainstream governance mechanism. It's increasing. I downloaded it from the UNCTAD website. It is about 40-something standards, but that's only a tip of the iceberg. And here I quoted from the paper co-authored by Axel, which you can download from the UNFSS website. The number of VSS has been constantly increasing. I guess its number is already over 400. And 30 years ago, VSS were a marginal phenomenon. However, now the VSS have become a mainstream governance mechanism to secure sustainability throughout the value chain. Yes. The number is not only the story. The coverage of sustainability standards is already widening. Sustainability map of the International Trade Center houses in total 255 VSS, which covers not only over 100 of agricultural products, but processed foods, fisheries and forestry products, industrial products such as electronics and energy products, and services such as tourism and trading and retailing services. But please note that this is not a comprehensive picture. For instance, there are many standards in construction sector, and they were implemented in some construction projects abroad, green building types of standards. But they are not covered by the sustainability map. So it's a kind of widening, it's a kind of mainstream phenomenon. The ratio of the products or projects that adopt VSS is not a majority, but it's also increasing. And there are two, I would say, phenomena that may spur the increase of VSS. The number one is, of course, the UN-sponsored 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. It may serve as a spur to the promotion of VSS. And this is a local, I would say, phenomenon. For Japan, the 2020 Tokyo Olympic Games may serve as an additional spur to the promotion of VSS in Japan, because the IOC recommended all food and foodstuffs served as a venue be certified by VSS. As you can imagine, Japan is not a food exporting country. It's a food importing country. So far, the Japanese farmers and foodstuff makers are not keen about adopting VSS. But as a result of the Tokyo Olympic Games next year, the situation may drastically change. And then, how can we assess impact the attainment of sustainable development goals? And here we should think of two different routes that have positive effect to the attainment of SDGs, namely direct effects and indirect effects. By definition, the VSS shape the way supply-side economic activities impact on sustainable development. In that sense, VSS have direct effect on sustainable development. VSS should strengthen sustainable development, but sustainability is multidimensional with economic, environmental, and social dimensions. So when assessing the effect of VSS, one has to take account of the potential tensions among these different dimensions. And VSS and the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. The following several slides will discuss the direct effect of VSS on the attainment of SDGs. Looking at the content of SDGs, we may focus 3 goals among 17 that may be directly affected by VSS. Namely, goal number 8 on decent work and sustainable development. Decent work and economic growth. And goal 12, responsible production and consumption. And goal 15, life on land. Let me make a brief view of these 3 goals. VSS cover individual targets of the goal 8 on decent work and economic growth, such as non-discrimination at work, prohibition of child labor and minimum wage, workplace safety, no forced labor, and freedom of association. So this goal 8 on decent work and economic growth matters, especially the coverage is on labor standard and workplace safety. So these goals are covered by many VSS. And then goal 12 on responsible production and consumption. The key word is the adjective responsible. These are the adjective that care about environmental effect of economic activities. So, some of the individual targets covered by the VSS. I made a brief revision in my slides, so I the waste management and waste disposal and chemicals and natural organic inputs, these types of workplace environmental care are covered. These individual targets are covered by many VSS. And finally, goal 15 on life on land covers targets for the conservation of natural life and resources. And VSS cover many of them, like biodiversity, soil, habitat and ecosystem restoration and rehabilitation, and wildlife. So these are the direct effect of VSS that directly affect and contribute to the attainment of SDGs. Now let's go to the indirect effect of VSS on trade. VSS may contribute to the attainment of SDGs indirectly through trade and economic growth led by trade. Then there is a question. Are VSS promoting trade or are they hindering trade? And my argument is that it largely depends on the structure and design of VSS, notably their cost-sharing arrangements, their compliance systems, and their transparency regimes. And my findings is that, number one, compliance costs are borne by producers alone in many cases. Likewise, certification cost, which is very, very expensive one, is also borne by producers alone. And on transparency, only standards and national adaptation documents are made public. That's it. These structure and design of VSS may hinder small and medium-scale producers and suppliers from implementing and adopting VSS. And also, multiplicity of VSS may duplicate the cost of VSS. This point was also referred to in Excel's presentation. And this is my last slide. The compliance cost and certification costs should be distributed among supply chain players, such as buyers and retailers, etc. And increasing transparency to cover not only standards itself, but governance structure, certification, and dispute settlement and financial statement may help reduce transaction costs incurred by VSS. And so as to tackle with the multiplicity of VSS, information should be provided as to which VSS should be adopted. And if there are local VSS, they should be preferred. And then comes the issue of mutual recognition and so forth, or harmonization. These types of informed reform measures may not be achieved solely by producer suppliers. And here is the need of public policies, in particular by the government of developing countries and international organizations. Public-private partnership for the diffusion of VSS is needed in that sense. Well, let's see what national multi-stakeholder platforms of developing countries of Brazil and international organizations can do. Thank you so much for your attention.
Once again, we'd like to thank both our keynote speakers, Dr. Excel Marks and Professor Junji Nakagawa, on this very interesting presentations, which I hope they are very valuable for you. Now we're going to take a quick photo. And for this photo, we'd like to also invite the opening speakers, Mr. Luis Philippe, if he's still here, from Firjan. Fabio Alves da Silva from In Metro, if you're still here, please join us on stage for a photo. Mr. Santiago Fernandez de Cordobra from UNCTAD. Mr. Odenbright Carvalho, I hope I'm pronouncing from Intermarati, Gustavo Ribeiro from Apex, and Ms. Vera Torstensen, please. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, now we're going to take a little 20 minutes pause for a coffee break. So should you have any questions for our keynote speakers, please, you can reach out to them outside. But if I may insist, could you please be back here by 11? Thank you. Bem-vindos de volta.
Welcome back. I would like to say that for the keynote speakers, we've had some questions from people from the audience and at home, and I would like to say that they will come back to answer the questions tomorrow in the end of the day. And yes, we will have the presentations available. And just one more information before we go on to the next panel. I realized that it's not clear to some people that we'll have lunch today. It's included. So just to make it clear, because we'll have another panel before lunch, so just for you to know that lunch will be here, you don't need to leave to have lunch. So now we'll start panel 1 that will discuss the importance of industry actors in the nexus of sustainable development and the global trade service. And we invite as the moderator Alessandro Amadio from Unido and the panelist Ana Carolina Sklow from the Brazilian Business Council of Sustainable Development, André Ramalho, from Braskem, Leandro Barcelos from CNI. And now I pass on the floor to Mr. Alessandro Amadio, who will coordinate the session. Just one more thing. Slido is open all the time, so if you want to send your questions while they are speaking, it's possible to enter the website to send your questions. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alessandro Amadio. I'm a representative of Unido here in Brazil. Unido is the United Nations for the industrial development. I would like first to thank Emetro and Firjan, who are hosting us here at this wonderful house, and also all the participants that work for this event. The portfolio of Unido here in Brazil is quite guided by the sector, the refrigeration sector, and also the industrial and engineering sector, and also with the development of the political situations in Brazil and the signature of the agreement between the European Union and Mercosur. We also have these discussions on standards, certifications, and all the things that are taking more and more importance. I would like to present briefly here the participants, because I think this panel is quite good. We have good formation. We have representatives from the private sector and also from industry associations, and also Ana Carolina, that works for the Brazilian Business Council for Sustainable Development. And she has a lot of tasks, among others, the energetic efficiency in the buildings and the SDGs and weather, forests, agriculture. She has worked before with ICF. And also for the Ministry of Science and Technology. She was part of the COP15 in 2016, and she has a wonderful curriculum. She has masters in environmental energy planning, and she's also an economist.
And the second panelist is André. André works for Braskem. I think it's one of the greatest producers in the world of thermoplastic resin like polypropylene, etc. André is a biologist and he has a master's degree in ecology, and he also has worked for the Environmental Agency of Rio de Janeiro, and also for ICF, and also for the Brazilian Council of Sustainable Development. And the last one, the journalist, is Leandro. He works for CNE, which is the Brazilian Industry Confederation. Leandro is dedicated to industrial policies, and he also has worked before for a project for the UN and Mercosur. And so I guess this panel really has a range of expertise, really interesting. So I have 6 questions here, two per participant, and I would like to begin with Ana Carolina. The first question: what are the challenges these days for the industrial sector here in Brazil, and what are the opportunities that you see for the Agenda 2030 for the sustainable development? Well, thank you for your invitation. It is a pleasure to be here. It is so rare to be able to speak here in my city. Sometimes I'm at São Paulo or abroad to talk a little bit about challenges. I think we have a few. I'm going to concentrate in 3. The first one is the climate change. And if we take a look at the agenda of the SDGs, today we have, if we take a look at the analysis that has been made by SDN, the Sustainable Development Network, they say that the climate change is one of the most difficult challenges to be overcome by Brazil. And today we don't see in our country the necessary conditions for us to be able to advance and improve the climate change issue. This is an international assessment that worries us a lot. The industry, the SDG number 9, it is seen as a topic that's still one of the challenges, but there's a trend to a slight improvement compared to other topics, so it could be very positive. And regarding the climate change, I really think that everyone knows a little bit of this context. And in the Paris Agreement context, when you have a common objective between all the signer countries, when you need to keep the increasement of the greenhouse effect gases at maximum 2.5 degrees. Brazil has presented its goals, and we presented a document that is focused on agriculture and forests, like people said here in the opening, but it really is working with all the sectors of economy, even if it's not, we don't have specific goals in the document. And Sebes presented last year as a contributor of the private sector here in Brazil for the construction of that sustainability agenda, what was considered a priority in the systems that we work in: energy, carbon market, deforestation, social issues, and mobility issues. And when we brought this specific proposal to talk about deforestation, the provocation that was made by the industrial sector was to show that although it felt like we were comfortable in the industrial sector because the greatest goals that the country was dealing with was for agriculture and deforestation. In case we were not able to comply, the goal will be able to work with that, and it is going to cost more for us. So all the sectors need to work together to reduce deforestation. And I think at this moment that we are living right now, I need to highlight the importance of it for everyone. And it's so interesting because the next day the Brazilian NBC was published. We had a meeting with our CEOs, in an initiative that we call Leaders Committee. We had 15 CEOs present, and the feeling that was really common for all of us is that we could go beyond, which is something positive because, of course, the government is trying to have an inclusive process to work with the academy, but I really think the private sector is the one who is going to implement it. And so the energetic efficiency in the electrical sector, which the goal was 10%, and the private sector believed that we could go beyond thinking of 20%. So there are opportunities from the sector. The sector is demanding that. Is demanding more ambition, and I think there are a few ways to do that. One of them is the pricing, the price of carbon. We could go a little bit in detail further on, but I think it is important to implement those technologies. And one of the other challenges, but it's really important to say, is the bioindustry. Remembering again that in Brazil we do need to work strongly to value the forest, understanding when we talk about technology, we are not talking only about the gadgets that we are so used to, but photosynthesis could be interpreted as a technology, and we need to take a look at biodiversity and all the services that forests give us of climatic ambientation. How can a service be traded? So as long as we need to understand, we need to value that economical situation, like the Brazilian reservoirs that they could go to 6 billion reals per year. So this is a stocked value. This should be seen with a different standpoint, not just the green because it's green. We need to see if it makes sense economically. And another challenge in our country is a social issue. The private sector is going to interfere directly and indirectly and in a positive and negative way. So this needs to be incorporated, and it has been even more incorporated by the companies because they need a license to operate, not in the strictest senses of a document of environmental licensing, but you need to have a license to acknowledge so that society can acknowledge it to move on. Referring productivity, referring the reducing of costs, to access new markets, to guarantee human rights. Sometimes this is not directly linked to the agenda of the companies, but we need to take a look at the racial prejudice, social violence, urban violence. And of course, the private sector has an important role in promoting the universalization of rights and understanding not only that, but as something that is really beneficial to business. Thank you so much, Ana Carolina. I would really like to ask a question to André, but to understand a little bit more the private sector standpoint. You know that beyond the technical regulations that are a demand, they are mandatory, they're going to affect the quality of products, there's a growing demand about the standards that are economically sustainable. And also those standards are being more and more required by the market. What is the standpoint of Braskem, and what are the benefits or challenges of that conformity? Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank Firjan and Inmetro for the invitation. I would like to compliment my panelists, my fellow panelists here, Ana and Alessandro and Leandro. Thank you once again for inviting me. So Braskem is a company, on the chemical industry. Like Alessandro said, we are one of the greatest producers of thermoplastic resins and from renewable sources. We produce from sugarcane and ethanol. And I would like to say a little bit about our relationship with those patterns and seals of sustainability. We don't work with nuts and natural oils like the other industries that are here, but our experience with these standards is really relevant, especially the way we see the opportunity to work with them, going beyond complexity or costs that they could bring. And I think the first point, everything begins with the need that is here today of transparency, the need for the way your business operates, how your products work. I think that these standards, they are here exactly to show us that. They help us show to society and investors and shareholders and consumers exactly how the company behaves, what are their policies, how are the projects that they develop, as a way to contribute in an official way. And sometimes we have audited ways that there is a serious agenda behind it, that sustainability is a part of our business. So I think this is the first element, is a way to answer those demands and anxieties, and they have different motivations. We can see from the investor's point of view, they have a concern with risks. Who are they financing? Who are they funding? What kind of safety this business can give me in terms of business continuation, of social reputation? Society has its own concerns on the impacts of those products that they are consuming. So I think that these standards are going to align, are going to help the companies create that bond with those players. I think this is a positive approach to understand it, and it is also an opportunity to use those standards to improve your managing and risk patterns. And I think there are many demands, and when you meet those demands, you can see clearly that the company has many benefits in terms of managing and also managing those risks. So the company is going to operate in a safer way, and it is going to see and understand long-term issues that in general are not very common in companies, especially here in Brazil, because they work with the short-term scenarios. So you can see that there's an improvement, and that improvement it is going to become a tool that is going to help that company in the future. When you start managing better your water consuming, you manage better your emissions and other factors that are going to contribute to the competitiveness of that company. And at the same time, this improvement in the efficiency process and the way you see the business, it is going to contribute to the operational resilience. This company is going to understand better all the factors, the external factors that could pressure the business, and they are going to answer those factors and create a safer operation. So when you look at the 2030, 2040 scenario and you see some vulnerability, I can anticipate to that vulnerability and adapt to it and change my processes. And when that potential event, if that happens, I'm already prepared to operate independently. So you have obviously the issue of reputation and the relationship with society. When you're able to improve and predict a little better, when you have a dialogue with social, with local communities, and on the business side, we can never let go the business thinking when we talk about environment and society, but in general, you see that when you improve your managing processes through those reflections that those standards bring us, you can improve your productivity, and therefore you can reach new markets, you can raise your margin, your profit margin, and etc. So today we have to understand a lot. Obviously we are a huge company, but when we talk about small and medium-sized companies, today this is a necessary factor to keep being a part of the global chain of supply. And this is the safety that you are going to give to your buyers, that you are operating under trust and reliable standards. The smaller companies are going to also make those greater companies feel safe too. And we all get to that point of competitiveness. Today, those who are not complying with those standards, They are not going to have to enter that market opening. When we are talking about exportation, it's hard to imagine exportations without complying with those standards. And my last point is regarding the SDGs, because when you adopt better standards, you are going to contribute directly with the goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. When we talk about water, when we talk about climate change, gender, equal salaries. This is something that I'm going to pass the floor again. And when we talk about exportations, talk about exports, Leandro from CNI, knowing that the growth of the international trade, we know that we are talking about the global value chain. So how do you think the standards, the VSS, could actually help the private sector to reach international markets and connect to the global value chains, and also to really contribute effectively to reaching the SDGs? First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Metro. Thank you, John, to be participating, being a part of this panel. As you said, the global value chains made 50% of the importation of the OCDE and 3/4 of the imports of the developing countries. And of course, that is going to contribute to the environmental, economical development of the countries that are involved in the global value chain. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of CNI. In 2014, we thought that we should have an agenda of specific markets, accessing those specific markets on the private sector. So we did a benchmarking study to understand how the international developed countries work. So we did this benchmarking with US, European Union, Japan, and we wanted to understand, to create that agenda for the private sector and work with the government. And we had a few conclusions. One of the first conclusions is that we should have a unified system with our government to talk about barriers in other markets, and we should have a typology of trade barriers so that we could sensibilize the private sector and so that could understand what are those barriers and what are the VSS. That's why with Apex as our partner, we created like a guideline, and we have 13 kind of barriers, and that was a reference for us of what we had of international materials, something that UNCTAD already did, and many different governments that are already working for that. So we have this manual, this guide for 4 years, so that the private sector can understand what are those barriers. We have 13 barriers. We have 4 types of them that are about tariffs with different costs, different types of barriers, tariffs. Those are the visible ones.
And non-import tariffs. And anyway, once we have this manual and the private sector is sensitive, we understand the opportunities and the barriers. And today we qualified, along with the productive sector, 4 or 5 barriers that are in the government system to be treated. But no company, no sector has ever brought voluntary standards of sustainability as a barrier. So they understand it as an opportunity to access other markets, as nobody had reported that. So those voluntary sustainability standards, the VSS, may bring benefits, real benefits to the companies to access new markets once they comply with the standards and certifications for markets and specific sectors who want to access or maybe change the direction of exports. They may use the VSS as a mechanism to facilitate the access to the markets. Some VSSs, like decreasing the carbonic gas emissions and avoid deforestation, among others, are certainly standards that will help access to third-party markets and reach the SDGs. We had thought of some to speak, but Professor Nakagawa mentioned number 12, that is consumption and sustainable production. And this is one of the goals that I would like to mention that the VSS may help us reach. Thank you, Leandro. Your point of view is very interesting about the VSS as a tool to promote exports. We have another round of questions, and please be a little faster with your answers because we are a little bit late. So the first is to Ana Carolina. I would like to know a little bit about how the Brazilian Council of Sustainable Development promotes dialogue among private companies, government, and civil society in Brazil on developing sustainability. Thank you for the questions. Yeah, all the players have to work together, and this is our concern. So we work a lot on advocacy between the private and public sectors, since the highest layers taking the CEOs to have a dialogue with the ministers and the intermediate layer, so that we have the technical body in both segments working together and understanding that the idea is not to take the recipe ready to be implemented, but build that all together, understanding the limitations that each side had. CBED, in this sense, has been working along with the government for some time in pricing carbon, suggesting the adoption of a market that is adequate to the profile of emissions in Brazil, so that we also have a period, a voluntary period, and a period of tests, learning, following all the international experience that we have in this sense, bringing the Brazilian characteristics and looking to the possibility of having the establishment of a minimum price to ensure the work of this market, so that we can have incentives and investments and create opportunities to ensure competition among companies and stimulating technical innovation of low emission of greenhouse effect gases. Between 2015 and 2017, the companies associated to the Council could invest about $85 billion in reduction greenhouse effect gas emissions, with a lot of projects with a significant reduction in the emission of these gases. In the social area, so just for us to be faster, I think it's interesting to mention that this year there was kind of a guideline of human rights for the CEOs, understanding the relevance of leadership in the subject, not only looking at their own operations, but also looking at the surroundings where the companies are, and also the productive chain. This document was launched recently in Portuguese, English, and French, and along with Portugal, we worked for next October to have this event for sustainable development that we are representing in Lisbon, and we'll debate a lot this subject. In Brazil, more than 10 companies have adhered to the commitment and have signed these guidelines, but this is a document that has just been launched, so this is something that will guide actions for some years. And just to mention two specific points in the agenda for natural capital, due to the 8th World Forum, Water Forum that we have in Brazil last year, we understood the legacy of the private sector, and we ensured the commitment of the companies in Brazil for water safety with the 6 goals. Each company is committed to each one, to at least 2 of these goals, and Braskem is here and helped us to build these goals, and we leadered this agenda with other companies, and we adhere to that. And with the efforts that were successful, we also developed the commitment for biodiversity due to the importance that the subject has next year, with the review of the targets to be taken to next COP that will happen in China, so that we can work on conservation, as we mentioned before, on forestation and agriculture, aligned preservation and production, and stopping the high rates that we have of species extinction, collaborating so that we have the economy based on this big biodiversity that we have in the country. Thank you, Ana Carolina. Another question to André. Braskem had developed some tools like the strategy for sustainability and the corporate policies for sustainable development. What is implicit in these tools is the sustainable production and how it benefits the Braskem business. What is the contribution that Braskem has with this tool to give to the SDGs? Well, Braskem is a company aiming at using plastic to bring quality of life to society, and is a company having sustainability aligned with the main objectives of the company. So this is the global policy of sustainable development in such a way to unify our work in this area in the many countries where we operate. And the big ambition that we have is that the company wants to be a reference in the chemistry sector in terms of sustainability in the many areas that it represents. Our focus today are water, climate, and post-consumption of plastic, but we also deal with human rights and many others. And what we did with these policies was working objectively to link the SDGs and the goals of the company, and obviously trying to search for something more quantifiable instead of simply linking our actions to our contribution. So we want more and more to show numbers. So what is the percentage, at least at national level or industrial level, that we have of contribution for these goals? And this is transferred with the 10 macro goals that are public, and all the information may be found in Braskem's website. We have economical, environmental, work, and human rights macro objectives that are followed and renewed every 10 years. So we have goals that will finish in 2020, and we'll start another cycle for 2030. So what we tried to do was link everything to the SDG. So our annual report will show exactly how each one of our actions contribute to the goals. We wanted to make it very clear and not simply something generic like the SDG, but we would talk about the targets and the project they are connected to. And we did it qualitatively, but we want to have it quantitatively. And our greatest challenge is to link that to our chain. It's not worth being a proactive company in the area and trying to develop on sustainability, but we want to ensure that our chain comes along. So what we've been trying to do more and more is to create new tools and build and train companies and our suppliers to work better in the field. So it also answers a little bit what was posed in the initial speeches about the difficulties for small and medium producers to deal with all the diversity. And today we don't do that specifically, but I've seen many Brazilian companies that not only help in training, but also sometimes finance the process of auditing or obtaining the many standards, and so that their chain works connected with the agendas for sustainability and somehow add value and reputation to the business. So I think it's a duty of the big companies to get closer to the medium and small ones and bring them to the agenda, because they have this big capacity and volume of financial resources to be dedicated, something that doesn't happen to the big companies. So our role is to help them develop regarding the sustainability standards. Well, thank you, Andrea. I have another question to Leandro, and then I have 3 questions from the audience. Leandro, What is the importance of sustainable development for trade? I mean, what is the impact of sustainable development on trade? Well, sustainable development is one of the goals of the WTO with its member countries, and it's being discussed in all the agreements, bilateral and multilateral agreements that Brazil is part. So sustainable development is on the agenda for trade and for industry. The benefits are engagement in sustainable projects in the productive chain and international reference, both for products and services. Today, we have at least 8 new standards on sustainability being created in the world every year. So it creates a new regulation, new governance on sustainability in the world trade. So we see the opportunity to renew consumption, production, everything in the private sector. Thank you, Leandro. Now we have 3 questions from the audience. The first one it's for André. You seem immersed with conviction that sustainability standards contribute to SDGs. What evidence do you rely upon when you make that statement? Well, I'm not saying necessarily that the standard contributes, but the way you answer to it generates contribution. So I'll give an example. By the climate agenda, for example, in Braskem, we are Golden Protocol and A in CDP climate. So for us to reach those standards, it demands us to have quantified targets and based on science to reduce the emission of greenhouse effect gases and bigger issues regarding adaptation. So in the process that we work to reach those targets and reach those rates, we generate big programs and big projects that we are more and more reducing the emissions, and we have a direct connection to SDGs on climate, dealing with the reduction of emissions and the standard for adaptation. I think it's not the standard, but the management process that we have to develop to comply with that. It takes us to reduce water consumption and climate footprints and gender equity in the company and so many factors that are brought by those who are interested in using those voluntary standards on sustainability to value their work and for competition also. The other question, I think it's to André, because this is very specific. The question is, what policy the companies have to incentivize and train the suppliers in VSS? Well, I will answer by the experience in Braskem and that I've seen in other companies, and it depends on the actuation of each company. In Braskem, our concern is on the capacity of maintaining production by the suppliers, mainly related to climate changes or water stress. I mean, the risk of stop working due to not adapting to the climate changes and producing in a sustainable way. So we have workshops with the CDP, and CDP has a supply program that we use to bring our suppliers. And besides that, the suppliers that we identify as critical in some agendas, we give training to them, generally using free tools that are available so that they in fact can use and learn without bringing additional costs. And other companies, as I mentioned, working in a bigger chain related to agribusiness and related to big, small and medium companies, they have taken trainings to these protocols that they want to be used, and many times they help finance audits and all the process so that they can be certified. So this is something that we've seen a lot in the private sector. Thank you, Andrea. Now we have 2 more questions, but I think this is to Leandro. The first one is, what is going to happen with the companies that do not take the VSS? within the process. And the other two, Leandro, and probably you may answer later on during lunchtime, because the question is the 13 barriers that you have identified. So you answered the first one, and the second one you answered another situation. So what happens? What happens to the companies? They close? Well, this is a possibility, but I think that standards or voluntary standards on sustainability, it's a matter of choice of the company, a choice of being internalized or selling to companies that demand that, request that. So they want to in fact, close, but they need to adapt to the niche that they will sell. Once they comply with the standards, they may enter to the markets that they want, like the European Union or the United States, and brands that demand those standards. And those who don't adapt or who can't adapt will be out of this market. This is the main consequence for the companies who do not adapt the VSS. And for those who made the last question, it's not 13 barriers, but 13 typologies. We have 13 identified. If you want to know during lunch, we can have a conversation on that. Well, thank you all. This was very interesting. I think that all the voluntary standards and everything related to that, we have a lot of opportunities that are very interesting. Leandro mentioned the opportunity for exports. And also, Andrea talked about opportunities to increase productivity for the industrial processes. And Ana Carolina talked about the opportunity that the voluntary standards have to improve sustainability of the industry and businesses. So I would like to finish our discussion with a question, I think, to Ana Carolina. How do you understand the long term, and how do you believe will be the impact of the voluntary standards in the world trade, but mainly what will be the impact on sustainability of the world industry? Well, I'll answer changing a little bit the question, because I think although we are here talking about the VSS, not everything that we see today in sustainability agenda is voluntary, and it also shows that we don't have to worry only at the long term, but also the short term. If we take as an example what happened via Financial Stability Board, of talking clearly to the bank that they need to incorporate in 3 to 5 years and reflect how their clients are vulnerable to climate changes and the impact to the companies. And we take a little bit of what Andrea was mentioning in terms of improvement of internal management and processes, and how companies are promoting internal transformation in a strong way so as to involve all the supply chains. We see that it's urgent and it has to be done now. There are no deadlines and opportunities. It's not an obligation if it's not voluntary. It shows companies that they have to work differently, and what we do is try to show that companies that are more and more sustainable will be best served. Thank you, Ana Carolina, and all speakers. I think during lunch they will be here available because there are more questions to be answered. Thank you all.
Thank you for the photo. I was just about to introduce that, but it's already done, so thanks, Santiago. All right, so we will now begin the panel, the second panel, actually, that's on the voluntary sustainability standards in the food and agriculture sector. So we would like to invite the moderator for this panel. It's Ahmad Mukhtar from the Food and Agriculture Organization. And the panelists are Lucia Helena Ward from Embrapa, Miguel Hernandez from Bon Sucro, Carlos Renato from Fair Trade International Brazil, and Camila Torres Meyer from Apex Brazil. Thank you.
Well, it's still good morning. So, buenos dias. Do we have Miguel here, our fourth panelist? No. Okay. So we'll go ahead with the three panelists. Okay, so, well, first of all, thank you very much to InMetro and Firjan for organizing this session. Of course, on behalf of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations where I work, I believe that you're all familiar with the FAO, the mandate and what we do in food and agriculture. But of course, we are partner agency in the UNFSS, the UN Forum on Sustainability Standards that we represent, and we are proud to be partner in this convention. So as it was introduced, this session will focus more on the role of VSS in food and agriculture sector. There was no better place to discuss that than Brazil, which is a fantastic agriculture producer and exporter, and probably one of the biggest exporters in future. Well, it still is, but in future it is going to increase. Just to introduce this session, that why are we going to discuss that? We know, and it was mentioned, that the VSS can deliver the positive economic, environmental, and social benefits for all producers, particularly the small-scale agriculture producers. For instance, the implementation of VSS can help farmers in developing countries to improve their farming techniques and product quality, thereby allowing them to participate in high value-added supply chains, value chains and markets. In turn, the VSS can lead to the higher and more stable prices for the certified farmers. However, due to the high cost of certification and compliance, often resulting from stricter environmental regulations and or higher wages, the smallholder may also experience increase in the production cost. And it was mentioned in the keynote speech, which in turn can hamper or affect the profitability. Moreover, a lack of institutional and technical capability to enable and access the certifications, particularly in developing countries, can present significant challenges to smallholders farmers in compliance to the VSS. But this is just problem of this is just aspect of the problem. So in this session, what we will try to explore through the expertise of our panelists is the role of the VSS in food and agriculture systems and products, and how it could be used as an enabler in the food and agriculture products and sustainable food value chains, rather than a barrier or potential barrier in these sectors and products, and how could it ultimately contribute to achieving the SDGs. So essentially, we would address the following four questions. First, as I mentioned, are the VSS enabler or hurdle for agriculture and food trade, particularly for small exporters? Secondly, how could the VSS be used to establish and strengthen the sustainable food value chains? And third, what needs to be done in order to improve alignment between international agriculture trade rules and VSS, particularly as we heard about the WTO system, WTO Agreement on Agriculture, and other relevant agreements. And lastly, the case for investment in upgrading the certification infrastructure and technical capability, particularly in the developing countries. So, it's a big ask, but I'm sure that with the different aspects or perspectives from the panelists, we would try to get some of these answers. So what I would request in this panel is that we initially have about 5 to 7 minutes initial remarks based on these issues by each panelist, and then maybe some of the follow-up questions and interventions, and certainly when there would be some questions from the floor. So with that, I mean, it's not really a particular order, but I was wondering if I could start with Madame Lucia Helena Watt, because she's manager research at Embrapa, because I understand that you would have done a macro research on these issues. You can share, and then we can go to the practical examples from the business and the producer sectors. So over to you.
Bom dia que meio-dia, mas
we are still before lunch. I would like to thank for the invitation to participate in this panel, such an interesting panel. I work with non-wood materials, specifically with Brazilian nuts and andiroba and other Brazilian local products from our forests. And the idea to treat here of these standards and the VSS, we are working with a few communities in the Amazonian, and a few of them are not working compliant to the certifications because of the costs to keep that certification, because most of these products that come from forests, they by themselves, they are already organics or they are sustainable. I work more with ecology issues to see the sustainability of the ways of harvesting, especially the way they do the harvest, and to understand how these species reproduce, what are the dynamics of them on the forests, and how people use those products. How do they harvest them, if this is sustainable or not. So my work, especially with this side of it, although we never abandon the side of the economical sustainability, because we can see that the sustainable development, this tripod, social, economical, and ecological, should always be an issue, because if we think only about ecology, I may not have an economical sustainability, and this is not going to be feasible. So we always need to think about all the production levels. And we can see that the producers, mainly people that live in the forest, they think on their ways of life. They think about many times we have cultures behind the way they use forests. And they want better conditions, better market conditions, better selling conditions. And we can see that they're far away. That producer is still far away from that market. And the chain is too large, too long. And sometimes even the enablers or people who many times transform or just those who are in the middle of the change, they get the most of that income. And many times the standards, the certification standards, are not beneficial to the producers. So I think it is one of the challenge is to shorten that chain, so that the industries or the market, they get closer to those producers, especially those producers who live from the forest. And to define VSS that are easier for them to adopt and to apply and to tell their story, because we can see that sometimes we can see a certification or a seal that tells the story of that product, shows the cultural side of that project, shows the life of those people who live from that. That could be an advantage, but the cost sometimes is too high. And we can see that most of those communities are not able to keep up with those certifications. And for them, it is not beneficial. It doesn't have any kind of function because what they do is normal. That is normal for them. They don't have to do anything different. We only need to write that down, to put that on paper. And we were able to do a few research, to realize a few research. My group, we did a study in Bolivia, Peru, and Acre, the Triplices Frontier, and we can see that the nuts, when we have the fair trade or certification standards or the organic certification, they help on the improvement of their practices. They improve on how to use the forest in a sustainable way. They actually bring that benefit. They are beneficial. But on the economical side, that's not really good because the assessment, when they price that product, they don't accompany that value of that certification. So many communities, they just abandon that certification. So in terms of production of that forest, of those traditional communities, the certification still has a lot of benefit to bring to them, but the great challenge is the cost, is how to do that. Thank you. Muito obrigado, Lúcia. Muito obrigado por...
In context, we would follow up with that. First of all, Miguel, welcome. We are really pleased to have you on board as well. Then we go to the second panelist, and I think it would be better to listen from Carlos Renato, who is president of the BR Fair, the Brazilian Fair Trade, and Café Sul, the cooperative on coffee as well, to have a perspective on the issues or the questions that I mentioned, particularly on the BR Fair or the Fair Trade international perspective. And then we would focus a bit more on the coffee in the second round as well. So over to you, Megan. Carlos.
Bom dia a todos.
I am president of a cooperative in the south of Espírito Santo, Café Sul. We are Fair Trade certificate, and now I am also working with the International Fair Trade Association here in Brazil. We have 21 organizations who are affiliated of orange juice and coffee, but in Brazil we have more. We have 44 of orange juice, coffee, honey, cashew, Brazilian cashew, and spread it through many states here in Brazil. And talk a little bit about fair trade, as it was said by our panelists from Embrapa. Fair trade has many standards and requirements, and many of them are working with the development sustainable DOD, the SDGs. So we need to work with a transparent or governance. The compliance of all the standards are discussed in an assembly with all the producers. We require the best agriculture practices. We have strict use of agrotoxic, and the additional incentive for those who work with organic products. We have a strong work with the social issues when we talk about youngs and gender. It is a great challenge in agriculture, not only in Brazil but in the world, which is the challenge to keep those young people in those fields of agriculture and child's work and slave work. Everything is under our standards. And on the economical pillar of fair trade, we have a minimum price for products, and we have a social price. In the case of coffee, that price comes for each bag of coffee that is sold. that special prize goes to a fund, and we have to develop projects for the development of that cooperative or association, or projects towards that community, that local community. So we have a plan, an annual plan of application that goes to an assembly, and if they approve, we can apply that. And beyond that, we have a minimum guarantee price that works with the cost of production. Today, we see this huge rise in the coffee sector here in Brazil. And the few producers who still have a protection are the producers who have the fair trade certification. So this is a challenge to other products. I wouldn't know today how to tell you the cashew nuts here in Brazil. We have it certified. I don't know if that minimum price certified is enough to cover the costs. I believe so, because frequently these costs is reviewed. They are reviewed. We always want to keep that producer with that guarantee, and this mechanism works this way. If the market falls below that guarantee price, we keep that minimum price. If the market is above it, we are going to give them that price that I just said. And this is in the case of coffee, it goes along with each bag that it's sold. So inside that philosophy of the seal, the certification seal that we work with, many points of the objectives of the goals are met, which are the issues of income of the population, of those workers, the issues, the gender issues. Many of our entities, they work with that, and our certification is a collective one. It certifies corporations and associations, and it's not individual. It works with small producers. Inside our rules, a huge percentage has to be for smaller producers. When you take a look at small properties, you have environmental diversity inside that property. Even when we talk about production, because most small producers here in Brazil, they produce coffee, but also other products inside that property, sometimes fruits or vegetables. And normally, the smaller producers, they take more care, and they pay more attention to the environmental issues. And I've heard Ana Carolina talking about the carbon issue. I think this is so important to agriculture in general, because it is required for us to take care of the environment and the property, but I think that the population that depends on that, this is a way for them to retribute to that producer. I think this is a this is a subject that needs to involve those producers. We need to play that role, but we also need to contribute. We need the contribution of those companies and the general population and the producers. The consumers today have a better awareness of the environmental issues, and the companies, they need to work with them. They need to reevaluate, like when we talk with CNI and Braskem, because in our case, in the case of the coffee, this is really clear. The companies are looking for their own certifications because they see that this is a point of no return.
So that's why we need society to help us work with that. Muito obrigado, Carlos. Agora,
we can move to the exporter's perspective, because we have with us a representative from Apex, Brazil, Ms. Camila Torres-Meyer. She's international trade analyst at the Apex. And if you can kindly share perspective from the exporter's perspective on these issues. Sorry. Thank you.
Boa tarde a todos. É prazer estar aqui com vocês.
To be here with you, and I am within the agribusiness in Apex, and today we support the promotion of export of 14 sectors, among them The ones that are close related to the VSSs are the sectors of coffee, sugar, meat, and fruit that are the main ones. But aside from that, we also work with the smaller sectors like organics and oviculture and another food in the sectors. Among those that I mentioned, the ones that suffer more in terms of challenges regarding the VSSs, Apex works with sustainability in a cross-linked, cross-sectional way, as Gustavo mentioned. It's very important for Apex because we believe sustainability is a competition differential for Brazilian companies, and the subjects for discussion in sustainability go through all the VSSs that affect mainly the image of the agribusiness in Brazil, that is the welfare of the animals, conditions for work and social conditions, and environmental sustainability. Apex understands the importance of the VSSs and also the challenges, as Lucia mentioned very well, in terms of costs, and also the complexity that we have today in terms of standards. And that's why we've been working in the sense of trying to help and support the medium and small companies in Brazil with a training in the projects that we have, those 14 sector projects that we have, and the identification of the VSSs. And we also had some recent changes in the regulation that we have in this cooperation project with the sectors. We signed an agreement that we pass on financial resources to the partners' entities, and we adopted a new regulation to support certification for the Brazilian companies aware of the difficulties of costs to adapt, the adaptation costs that all companies must have, and this cost need to be diluted in the long term because it's quite heavy for the small and medium companies in Brazil. So aside from the qualification, we have been working with financial support to the first certification of the Brazilian companies. And another relevant aspect that when we talk about Apex, because when we mention our name, we think about the fairs and conventions that we have, but aside from qualification and helping certification, we are working on the offer in Brazil and access to the market. We have an area in Apex that is Gustavo's area following the changes in the standards. And besides that, within the sectorial processes, we have the projects of coffee and sugar and fruit with some items to defend the interest, because sometimes the company has the certification but has some problems with the regulation, or the AVS has problems, and Apex works along with a consultant to check what may be done and how we may access the markets that we don't access so far. And we see a big increase in VSSs in Europe mainly. So today we say that not only the company, and I think Leandro mentioned that today, what would happen to the companies if they don't adopt the VSS. Basically, they cannot access the global market without the global gap. That is one of the most required VSSs for fruit and meat and fish. And what the company wins, aside for the sustainable practice that we may mention with some companies in the sectorial area, they also gain access to the market. And also we see an improvement as the companies get prepared for some VSS, they also gain preparation for other ones. Somehow they are more prepared and qualified, promoting agricultural modernization. So basically that's it, and then I'll talk specifically about that. Muito obrigada.
Just like any food or dinner or lunch, it should end at sweet dish. And we have a very sweet intervention from a representative of Bon Sucro, Mr. Miguel Hernandez, who is Director for Latin America. I hope you will tell us very sweet things about the experience in sugar industry. Over to you, Miguel.
Thank you, Ahmad, for the invitation. So, quero cumprimentar em português os participantes. Muito prazer pelo convite. Prazer voltar ao Brasil. E agora vou trocar ao inglês. Só para saludar. Yes, you know, as a Latin America representative, my work is to support the sustainability of sugarcane from all over Latin America, including the Caribbean. And you are right, the only thing that sugar has in common is that it is sweet. If you go country by country, there are many challenges, and when it comes, smallholders is where we found more challenges. Because usually smallholders, whether they are in sugarcane or other crops, are usually out of the system. They don't have access to financial support, or they don't have access to the market. Particularly in the case of how Bonsucro works. By the way, who knows who's Bonsucro? Oh, what is Bonsucro? Have you heard of Bonsucro before? ¿Alguien conocía Bonsucro? Yeah. Don't be shy. There is my colleague, Livia, also. She's our representative our coordinator in Brazil. I'm jumping from one subject to another, but I'm asking if you know Bonsucro, because the first certification of Bonsucro happened here in Brazil 11 years ago. We are celebrating that. And Brazil is the biggest producer of certified sugar. Actually, 60% of the mills we have certified are here, and we are growing and growing. So imagine the importance Brazil has for Bonsucro. In the case of farmers, I think, coming back to the original question, I think the certification system is a tool and can be positive, but they cannot do it alone. So I want to take this opportunity to call an action, because smallholders need support. They need technical training, they need financial support, also they need information on how to seize the opportunity available in the market. If they use the certification system, well, they can be ready and very prepared to take advantages. Because our system is very simple. Bonsucro standard has 5 principles and 53 indicators. But in summary, Bonsucro certification is about legal compliance, and that is the minimum of sustainability in any commodity. Comply with the law, labor law, law related to the water use or land management. And the second principle is all about social. It's a standard very strong in social. I usually say that we are like the marketing of ILO, because we have in our standard 8 conventions related to zero child labor, supporting the participation of the women in the sugarcane sector, and all related to union, the freedom to join a union, and so forth. Land management, land tenure, as an example. And the third element is economy, providing a solution. Once you go throughout the certification system, you are ready to sell to the market. So imagine if you are a smallholder and I'm telling you all this, could be rocket science. And there is where I'm coming to the point that the smallholder needs support to understand how they can implement all this certification system and be professional. I was talking about news. I was last week attending the sugarcane conference in Miami. It's about trading and the world of market. They were not good news, because the price of the sugar is low. The most important producer countries like Brazil, India, there is a downsize of the production due to the weather and bad yields. And I know this is not a panel about trading, but it's important to mention this. India, the government of India, support is good for them, because India has subsidized supporting the smallholders. So they, by default, smallholder get a good price, and the mills get half of the price of the market. But this is not the case in Brazil and other countries where there are no subsidies. So it's important to understand this implication, because even though we are a sustainability certification, we are embedded into the world of sugar. Bad news for the world of sugar: if you are a mill farmer, how are you able to certify, how the certification will be attractive if the market are not good, if the end user and brands are not supporting the transitions. But that's the only bad news. The rest is good news because more and more we are working as a platform. So we work with the smallholders. Here in Brazil, for instance, we have Socicana, Asobari, and Orplana organization that you probably know. Most of them are based in the Center-South. They are members, and we are supporting them into the transition. But if you are a sugarcane farmer, to whom you sell your sugarcane? You don't sell the sugarcane to a brand or to a company that produces ethanol. You sell the sugarcane to the mill. So we are working also with the mill to encourage them to support more the farmers. And on the other side, if we see this as a channel, value chain channel, the farmers, the mills, and we have the market, we are also working with the brands. All the most popular brands that you know, Unilever, Pepsi-Cola, Shell, Bacardi, Pernod Ricard, Mars, Ferrero, Barry Callebaut. I am missing Livia? No, all the brands. So those are brands that are supporting the transition with goals and commitment to source certified products, sustainable products like sugar. So what we are telling to this brand, look, you are the driver, you are the engine of the transition. Help the mill, help the farmer to do this transition so we have a circle where the benefits from the market, more consumers asking for certified sugar, are buying your products, and then you are transferring the benefit of those sales to the mills, and the mills are transferring the sales of those to the farmers. I'm going to stop here with a couple of examples because I know that we have limited time. But I want to share another experience where we are working with PepsiCo, a mill in Mexico, supporting smallholder. This is the thing that we need to promote because in the case of Mexico, 95% of the production is in hand of smallholder. So the mill depends on the smallholder if they want to produce sugar, certified or not. So what we did is, PepsiCo is buying from this mill. We are allocating resources provided by PepsiCo to support the smallholder. This mill works with 8,000 smallholders. I have been with them, most of them 2 months ago. On average, they have 2 hectares. It's complicated for them to produce sugarcane and to live, and this is what they do. They don't have other land. They have 2 or 3 hectares, so they need to survive. They need to do their best. So what we are doing is developing a program for 2 years where we will be providing support to small farmers, teaching them how Bonsucro works, and with the time, certifying. Once they are certified, they can sell the sugarcane to the mill, and we all are happy. The farmers receive support, they get a better price, the mills get the volume they need for the client, that is Pepsi-Cola, and Pepsi-Cola is also supporting the transition. So this just as an example of a project that is beginning, and we want to promote more like this here in Brazil and everywhere, because we are a global organization and we have presence worldwide.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Well, it is interesting to know that even the sugar farmers have to take VSS with a pinch of salt. So it's good, they would not get too much sweet. No, thank you for raising all of these issues and particularly leading to the second round, which I wanted to focus a bit more on the products or the sectors, and in particular on the smallholders. And I think we have to keep in mind, I mean, of course, as FAO, we are always focused much more on the smallholder farmers than other. It is not only due to the subsistence farming and political issues, but the fact of the matter, and you have heard various figures, but on average, it's 90% plus production done by smallholder farmers across the globe. The other thing is that in this region, in the Latin America, probably we have a better system of the cooperatives or the collective actions, as we say. That is not the case in Asia and Africa in particular. So we have to think that smallholders do not always have those platforms available. But that leads to our second round of discussions. Miguel has already mentioned some specific things about the sugar, but if I can go for another round, starting with, in the same order, starting with Lucia. If you can pick, let's say, one product example or sectoral example, and then if you can kindly share also, apart from the specific example, whether VSS has been positively contributing and how can the introduction of VSS in that sector has in a way contributed towards the overall sustainability that can lead to the contribution of the SDGs. Or if I can be a bit provocative here, because oftentimes we talk quite big and ambitious that the standards, all of these standards would contribute to the SDGs, but we have heard, and oftentimes in agriculture sector, it might just stop at getting a bit more market access. So we have to be very honest and clear over here that what exactly are we doing now. However, if we are just doing the market access exercise, how can we enhance the impact to really achieve the sustainability and contributing towards the SDGs? So with that, a request to get a little bit more into the sector or the product that you want to pick. We'll start with Lucia first, please.
Eu já falei pouco, sobre isso.
A bit about it, but in fact, there are many points. For example, I work in Amazon with specifically Brazilian cashew nut that is all over Brazil and from Acre to Amapá, and there are many initiatives of certification, mainly forest certification. It started 10, 15 years ago to define the standards for certification. There are the ones for management, how to collect the material without destroying the forest, and so that the product coming from it is works in the long term, because sometimes there are questions mainly due to the cashew that is a seed. And we are taking it from the forest. We are taking the seeds out of the forest. So when people question, the market questions how to do that for it to be sustainable. And when we have the standards, we define what are the limits of exploration, the means, and how to explore those products, those forest products, and how to keep that over time. So we work on standards mainly from the FSC on how to explore the forest so that those products over time won't be missing. And there is also the organic certification and the fair trade certification developed for many of those products, in which the fair trade takes a little bit more care on the social issues, and all of them deal with the slavery and genders, and the forest certification is more concerned about the maintenance of the forest, and the organics more focused, more concerned about the use of pesticides and having the quality of the product in terms of contamination due to diesel oil, and contamination of toxins, aflatoxins that were a serious problem in the cashews. There is food, so there is the point of the quality of the product, and fair trade that looks a little bit more to the fair work and payment and all the social points. So there are standards and some cases of certification for these products, as I mentioned before. And the big point, the big difficulty for that to be happening,
I think there are two things. But first, one is the consumer, the European consumer, who's already really exigent. But I really think that many times when you have other links in the producing chain, we can still maintain a few of those standards, of those features to put a seal, but I don't think that goes exactly directly on the producer. And when many times when we talk about sustainability and the environment, We need those standards, those certifications. We need them to go until the last level, to the final end, which is the producer. He needs to get that benefit. When we talk about the carbon credit, that's important. And we have been discussing that in Rondônia, in Acre, the issue to work that credit, that carbon credit, to develop sustainable project to those communities in order to don't have that as an income. Look, I have a forest, so I have an income. I don't need to do anything else. No, those credits would be to develop technologies, to develop the managing of that business, which is really is a problem there. So, but in terms of standards, we already have many things advancing in terms of what would be those standards, what would be the indexes, what would be the harvesting fares or taxes, what are the condition of those products. But in practice, we still don't have that going on in a large scale right now.
Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, foi muito interessante.
I'm introducing a new voluntary standard now in order to be on time. The next interventions I would request to be between 2 to 3 minutes because we would have some questions from the floor as well. Hope this standard is accepted and implemented. So with that, over to, we will go to Carlos first and then Camila.
Falando na questão de mercado,
and implementation, today the organizations who have that fair trade certification, they export to many countries in Europe, US, a few to Japan also, and that's because of these. Because we need to meet those conditions for the certification. And one of the things that we are working on the organization, and we need to be organized in associations to make that market accessing feasible, because the small producer, when they work individually, they have a lot of problems to access that market. And so today, people who are organized in some kind of cooperative or association, they have a closer access to that. And one of the things we need to do in that prize that we give is the development of an association that sometimes become a cooperative. And they are able now to reach that exportation market, that export market. In the case of a cooperative, when they represent that small producer or the buyer or the importer. So we eliminate the facilitators in the middle of the change. We know that the smallest part of that revenue goes to the producer, and that's really easy to happen in the coffee sector. I read something before I came here. 0.5% of a cup of coffee in Europe is what goes to the pocket of the producer. If we take into consideration how much it costs to the final consumer, how much it is paid to the producer, here is really little. Not only here, but in many countries in the world. So our value chain is not really transparent. We need to be more transparent in that value chain so that the person who is at the very end and needs to survive from that activity, because we know that we need food safety here in Brazil. When we talk about food, 80% of food here in Brazil, basic food, comes from the family agriculture, the small producers. But the revenue, the effective revenue of that producer is still very low. So our consumers and the society needs to demand more transparency. And we need to demand more transparency in that value chain. We need to show how much are you paying when you buy it in the market and how much goes to the pocket of that producer. This is really clear for us who work with that on a daily basis. But anyway, when you enter that process of certification, today the certificator, the organic certificator, they sell everything they have because there's a lot of demand. We have the law of the offer and the demand. So we have a fair trade cooperative since '98 with contracts, with short-term contracts, because we need to produce a sustainable product that the consumers really want. Muito obrigado, Carlos.
Value chains or the share in the value chains. I would just like to emphasize this is extremely important. In FAO, we have launched a network. It is called Sustainable Food Value Chains Network. It's a platform you can all join. You can check on the FAO website. It is open to the producers, to consumers, to even the societies that are, or the cooperatives that are in that one, essentially to focus more on the all parts of the value chains, so all part in the value chain, not only to make it more sustainable, but having more equitable distribution as well throughout the value chain. So with that, could I move to Camila, please?
Talking about the sectors that we work with, we can see huge evolution in the case of the coffee. Like he said, sugar, 60% already has a certification. In the case of meat, we also have many companies that are able to have VSS certifications. We are still we still want people to have those certifications in terms of VSS. In the meat sector, we did a study in this process to bring information to companies and comparing what are the certifications more used on those countries that are competitors with Brazil, like Australia. And we are taking that information to trainers, to producers. And in terms of fruits, the fruit sector, this is not a very mature market. We still have a position here in Brazil. I think we are the 15th producer of fruits. We are not compared to other products in the agribusiness, but we need to obtain that global gap, and we can see that we have many positive factors like the reducing of water and agrochemistry and the harvesting of fruits and in the crops of fruits. And now I can see when we talk about organics, in terms of processed products, when you use many ingredients, not in the case of coffee because you only have one ingredient, but when we work with with different products, we need to work that chain. And we realize that we have the need to incentivize that change at the beginning when we have a highly different product like a protein bar. When you use many different organic certifications, but they have a problem to find the organic inputs. And we know that Apex has a limitation to act in that productivity change. This is a challenge for us too. Obrigado, Camila.
Quite a lot of sweetness on this issue, but would you like to add a bit more on particularly some of the perspectives that how are you in particular dealing with the compliance and the certification issues in the sugar sector for the smallholder farmers? Because that is one of the questions, and then we'll go to the specific questions.
As I said in the beginning, unfortunately, most of the time the smallholders are out of the system, and there is where we need to focus. One of the things where there are weaknesses is land tenure, the title or the right to access to the land. There is where we can contribute with the smallholders because sometimes they work on the land, but maybe they don't have the title. And it's a contradiction because you go to an audit and the first requirements, legal compliance, or show me a title, and they don't have it. They are totally out of the certification. But let's not think that everything is written on stone and this is, it's black and white and you are out. But in terms of weaknesses, land title is one of them. Also, most of the time and this happened to me when I visit smallholder, when I visit farmers in general, you can find farmers that are third generation sugarcane producer, so they know how to produce sugar. There is nothing I can tell them how to produce sugar because they have a lot of experience. But when it comes gathering the data and registering what they are doing, there you find out that is the main barrier, and there is where we are focusing. I explained it before that we are a platform, so we don't work alone. Bonsucro as an organization is small. We work with our members, and there are some organizations, NGOs, with knowledge on how to transfer and how to train, transfer knowledge and train farmers. So that is where we are providing some support, developing the templates so they can register the use of agrochemical, some data in terms of water. We don't ask them about greenhouse gases emission because this requires calculation. It's going to be complicated for them. Also, trying to change the mindset about child labor. In some countries, there are some issues, and we need to have the sensibility to understand what is going on. For instance, in Central America, in El Salvador, there is many insecurity, and the families prefer to bring the children to the field because if they left the children at the home, it's too dangerous, and they can be kidnapped, and also the gang. It's a terrible situation. So they bring the children to the farm, and what can you do if you are there and you see children? You cannot tell them, hey, you have to go back home because that's what the standard said. So this requires some negotiation with the mills, so the mills can provide some support, some child care support during the day. So the participation of the mill, because the sugarcane goes to the mill, is critical, so they can provide some support to alleviate the political and insecurity situation. And another element is the use of personal protection equipment. A smallholder usually does all the practices because they don't have money to hire an employee and do the applications or the fertilizers application. There is where also we are changing the mindset that you need to wear some personal protection equipment, and we do negotiations with the mills so they can provide this kind of support free of charge, or at least, with a minimum price, so they can wear masks, gloves, and protection equipment, so they are not in contact with the agrochemical. And we always say this: one farmer or one worker that is sick is not good for the family that depends on this worker or farmer. It's not good for the mill because then they don't have an alternative to replace this missing person, and someone goes to the field and produce. So it's better to avoid the risk and to change the mindset than trying to find a solution once there is a problem. All this together takes time. It's not easy when you are not familiar with all these kind of practices, but required by the certification system. And most of the certification requires the same, or whether it's Bonsucro, organic, fair trade, and other certification. I think what is important here is always sensitiveness. Sensitiveness in terms of how you can transmit this message to the farmers. We were requested not to provide, not to present with PowerPoint today, but there are some pictures that is easy. I wanted to share a picture where we provided a training under a tree because we didn't have a meeting room. And you cannot bring the farmers to a meeting room, so let's do the training under the tree and let's do whatever we have there. But the important thing is how you transmit the message, so after the training they go back home and implement that. That's one point. And the second point is that you monitor that they are doing the thing, because maybe during the training they say, oh great, everything you are telling me, I will do it. But imagine with 40 degrees wearing, all this protection equipment, doing all the things under the sun, they won't probably do it. So this requires some kind of monitoring, so that they understand that they have to do it. It's not only that you take the training today, but the day after you go back home and do the different thing. It's about mindset changes.
Thanks a lot, Miguel. Thank you. Now we go to the questions from the floor. So a new voluntary standard, I would request panelists to restrict their reply to 1 minute because we are really running out of time. I'll take question 2 and 3 together to start with, and then the first question to all panelists. These are directed to Lucia. I think you can read, Lucia. First, you mentioned that the income of the producer is lost in the processing. Why couldn't they pay for the certification? And then how do you see other activities or actions to complement the certification of these products? And if I can add my own bit is that, what are the possible models to finance their certification cost? I mean, what has been the experience in your view? Very quickly, please.
Very quick. Poder.
Of course they could, those operators, the processing operators, but the problem is that the chain, the production chain of those products, still it is not very organized. So you have many links along the way, along that process, from that product that comes from that production, really on the mills or the agricultures, but until you get to that processing company, if they have a quality product, that is going to reduce their cost at the end. So that could be a value that they could pay for that product, that we call those good practices products. But that chain is not organized, like Carlos Renato said, because you don't have the cooperatives, you don't have the associations, many smallholders are individuals, and you have the facilitators that go in the middle to get higher income in their pockets to get to that final industry, a company that is going to benefit from that product. So we need to improve that. So I think that would be really feasible. But another question about the complementary actions to that certification to add value. So I really think that mainly is the managing issue. We really need to focus on that managing of that business of those the smallholders, because we talk a lot about the cooperatives, but it is really far away from the reality, especially those smallholders, because we need to improve infrastructure. We want to improve the infrastructure, but we don't improve management. We need to improve that business. It is agriculture, but it is a business. We cannot think of that as a survival. We need to see that as a business. There are costs involved, there are logistics involved, we have a market involved, and the producers, the smallholders need to get in that dynamic. Muito obrigado. Agora nós temos poucos minutos e uma ótima pergunta.
You have a very good question. Thank you for that. So that is, I think, is the key question. And very briefly, I would request all panelists to comment on this one. How are VSS relevant to SMEs, or I would say all of the producers that do not export abroad? So is it really relevant, or how is it relevant? Could we start with, okay, Carlos, we start with, and then Camila.
Como as NVS seriam importantes para as empresas que não
I think that this is what we've been discussing here, so that the companies need to get ready to the international market, improving the management to adopt the sustainable practices. You are still meeting the national market. So I would say that it is important to that company to save water, adopt sustainable practices, do not use biocontaminants. This brings a lot of learning to that company too.
And also technological modernization. So I think that they are relevant in this sense. But I believe that it would be the first step, reorganize it internally so that it is ready to export. Because today, and talking a little bit about Brazil, we do not value that much as other countries like Europe or the United States. So I think it's more advantageous for the company to have a certification and than to comply with the international demands. It is important for the national market, but then they will have access that they wouldn't have with the SME. So this is my opinion. I don't know if you want to contribute. Well, I consider the internal Brazilian market and the Brazilian consumer as having a different point of view when they request more, they demand more from the companies as well. We still lack general awareness of the society, but there are niches and cities mainly, the main capitals in Brazil, for example, where today you can go to any supermarket chain and you have organic products or agroecological products. So the Brazilian consumer has changed also its understanding on these questions related to sustainability and mainly environment. So I think that even those who don't export and sell in the internal market might be concerned and pay attention because our consumers change the way they consume. So I always mention the example of coffee because this is what I work with. We are the second world coffee consumers. We are about the first. We are only missing for the United States, but we still consume low quality products and a lot of non-sustainable products, but it's been changing. And today we have 2 to 3% increase in the commodity market of coffee and about 15 to 80% of organic and special coffees. So there's a change in the behavior of the consumers. Pay attention to the big brands in the supermarket. You only see that the standard coffee in the past there, like the traditional or extra strong, and now we have special coffees and organic coffees, a big diversity of products. So it means that internally, our consumers and our society are changing the way they see things. So if the company wants to survive in the future, they need to pay attention to our internal market. Muito obrigado, Carlos.
Yes, 2 comments. Brazil is a federal country, so here we have national law and federal law, correct? If you are a producer and you comply with the federal law and the state law, you are okay. Just as an example, a lei trabalhista, o Código Florestal, are important law for Brazil. So you are okay if you comply with this law. And I think, as I mentioned it before, the minimum of sustainability is legal compliance. And I will keep repeat this and this and this anytime. There are other indicators, but if you are a farmer, whether you are a coffee producer, sugarcane producer, or any other kind of product, it's important to take a look and also be sure that you are complying with the law. That is one comment. And the second is, as a consumer, we have a responsibility. Why, if we are certifying products and exporting this product, why, as a local consumer living here in Brazil, we cannot ask to the market, to all the supermarket or the stores for certified products? Because when the time, and do this exercise, the next time you buy a certified product, imagine what is behind. Behind is zero labor, zero child labor, supporting the women participation, all compliance with the Sustainable Development Goal, plus the legal compliance in the country. So imagine all the effort, and also what is more important, when you are buying a certified product, you are supporting the farmers, whether it's a small farmer or medium farmer, you are supporting the local production. Brazil is one of the most important producers of coffee and sugar. So the best coffee you can drink is organic and fair trade with Bon Sucro sugar next time.
Well, thank you very much for that. And for the last advertisement, you would have to pay commission to Firjan. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all panelists. I know that there were plenty of other questions as well, and we have the issues. But since I work for the FAO, our first mandate is to ensure access to food. And I know that there is an access to food outside. I don't want to be between you and the food now. But in the end, just one quick question is that, at least for the food and agriculture, where, by the way, most of the VSSs are in this food and agriculture sector, we need to convert, even if there are some challenges, we need to convert those challenges into opportunities. We have heard some of the examples. Of course, there are certain issues like the compliance and certification costs, but there are models that could be found, and there are models that are available and being practiced in different parts of the world. And of course, there are partners as well. There are partners like the associations, there are cooperatives, there are international development partners like us, the UNFSS, FIRJAN, APEX, all of the others. So let's convert the VSSs into opportunity and contributes to the achievement of the SDGs, but for now the first achievement would be to be on time over the lunch. So with that, thank you very much to all of the panelists for such a fantastic views. Thank you and have a nice lunch.
Agradecemos a participação.
Thank the participation of all the panelists. We are all invited for lunch that will be served at the same place of the coffee break, but I will ask you first to come here to the front for the photo of the panel.